chance. Tomas hurdles in. He scores! What a goal! Metco! He's from Carey Price and then the bar. Are you kidding me? You must be kidding me. Did you just do that, Alexander Barkov? What a stop by Lundqvist! Score! What a goal! It doesn't get any better than this.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Hockey Podcast. I'm your host, Gamby, with my co-host, Brandon, as always, and the season is underway. We are ready to go. We have everything set up to go for the season start, and we decided to start it off with a tips episode. So we wanted to go over kind of in-season tips to get everyone ready for what to do, because there's a lot of freaking out, there's a lot of hot hands, there's a lot of ads drops that'll start to happen, and we want to give you advice on how to maximize that, because there's a lot of mistakes you can make, and there's a lot of ways to take advantage of everything happening. So we want to make sure that you're fully prepped, whether you're a beginner or advanced. There's probably stuff in here that'll help both sides. And aside from that, we also wanted to plug a few things really quick. One thing is we launched a YouTube series called Building Winners, a fantasy hockey story, very cheekily, that pretty much follows my leagues across three different leagues. Or three teams, rather, across three different leagues. It's a Cats League, a Keeper League, and a Points League. And pretty much what it is that it's both entertaining and it's supposed to be extremely useful in the sense that all the advice we give, for example, our weekend pickups or week pickups or weekend pickups, a strategy we say in terms of ads, and on top of that, like unsustainable Wednesdays, that's all going to be seen. So I'm going to put all that into action. So imagine that all that advice that we're giving you is being put into action. Same as like in a draft when, we do drafts on screen and you can follow along with what we've been saying all off season. It's virtually the same thing, but in season. So if you haven't already, look up our YouTube, search Fantasy Hockey on YouTube, and you'll find us pretty quickly on there. Okay. And then Brandon, you talk through really quick. We wanted to brief you on how this season works. So if you're new to the podcast, we want to brief you on what to expect in season.
Yeah. So basically, we've talked about this before. So if you've been listening this offseason, you probably already know all this. But the general idea of what we're going to do here is on Mondays, we're going to give you a preview of the week and a review of the previous week. And we're calling it a Monday episode, but we're trying to get these episodes to come out basically the end of the day before. So it'll come out Sunday night, hopefully. And, so Wednesday will be Unsustainable Wednesdays, as it's always been, where we talk about unsustainable players that are either doing too well or not doing well enough for where they should be. It's not just like us guessing either. We'll be looking into, ice time and shooting percentage and all this types of things that make a player look better or worse than they actually are or that they should be. And in those episodes, we'll also tend to give you, if there's been major line changes and that kind of thing, that'll boost a player's value pretty significantly or drop it depending on what happened. So that'll be covered in those episodes as well. And then Fridays is basically a weekend preview where we give you guys to pick up for Friday, Saturday, Sunday to try to maximize starts or to fill any holes that you had coming into the week and trying to make sure that you can finish your week strong and get that win in as many categories as you can or get the win in the points league.
Yes, Wednesdays are a little bit more kind of stat heavy. And we bring in and talk a lot about stats. And then on Fridays, it's a little bit more casual. And Mondays, your normal review and preview sort of thing, a blend of stats and casual. So there's a lot of stuff in there that'll help you win your league. And it goes on all season throughout your playoffs. So it's something to be consistent with and listen to. Okay, so let's jump into these tips here. We've got 11 tips for you on what to do in season, what to not do also. So let's start first with number 1. Our rule is titled here, don't rush to trade early, just knock on doors. So Brandon we both have slightly differing opinions on this to an extent. So I'm going to let Brandon start with his because he likes the knock on doors approach.
Yeah, so I think the general concept here is if you're trying to make trades early, hardly anything's going to go through because people are just going to be looking at whatever draft position they drafted them in and use that as kind of, which makes sense, right? The league, like the season has barely started. There's nothing really to be making moves on, except for situations, especially in positional leagues where GMs have either auto-drafted themselves into trouble or have drafted too many of one position and are clearly needing to make a trade. In those cases, those are the doors I like to knock on. Guys that drafted 5 centers. If you didn't, if you have flexibility at your center position and you see a team that doesn't, those are the guys you can essentially move up a little bit from where maybe you drafted your player that they may need in the draft. But at the same time, the idea of actually being able to maximize your value this early in the season is extremely difficult. I would only really try to push hard if if somebody's like actively trying to trade one of their players that you're interested in that situation, right? Like it's their 4th or 5th center and they're just trying to move him because they're in bench trouble. Then maybe you want to try to do something because odds are they will make a trade with somebody or drop the player and then you're in waiver mode. So those are the situations to basically pay attention to. And it's something you should be doing when the draft ends anyways. Take a quick spin through all the teams and see where the pain points are. Especially in a Cats league, you can see if somebody's extremely lacking in PIMs or hits or whatever, and maybe try to take advantage of that. It doesn't have to happen right early on, but it'll give you an idea of the teams that you'll be likely able to target for trades. And not target in like a bad way, just somebody that you could mutually benefit from.
Yeah, and on my side, I think I agree with everything Brandon said, but I'll add to that I'm more cautious of trading than Brandon is. And the reason for that is if you see, you watched our draft videos and everything, and we tend to go after guys a little earlier than most. And so what ends up happening is, like, say a Jonathan Huberdeau, for example, who I got 5th or 7th round, somewhere between that range. If I go out and trade him, to me, he's potentially a top 20 player, right? And so I would expect to be compensated for that if someone were to come after my Huberdeau. And on top of that, he's a wing. So there's a lot of scarcity there, and on top of that, he's a good player. But the problem is that when someone comes knocking, oftentimes, especially this early, let's say the first 2 weeks of the season, you'll see people come and knock on the door and try to pay what their draft value was. So they say, oh, well, you got a 5th round guy, so I'll pay you a 4th round guy. And I'm like, no, I want more than that. And then it kind of falls apart. But that's really what ends up happening. So you don't really maximize value. Now, on the flip side of that, you can be the person to knock and say, well, give me this guy that I was targeting, let's say, as a 2nd rounder, and you took him in the 7th rounder. Will you take like a 5th round type player, right? Because that's how everyone thinks in the first 2 weeks, which is really weird, which really you should still be drafting by your rank and how good the player is supposed to be. But people tend to not do that. So that's why I advise caution when trading too early. Okay, let's move on to number 2 here. Decide who you'd drop early and keep them in the back of your mind. So pretty much what I mean by this is when you're going to... There's a lot of hot hands at the beginning of the season, right? Right now, we're already seeing Cody Glass, we're seeing Victor Olofsson, we're seeing Andreas Janssen, we're seeing just a lot of players out there that are getting added and seen as hot hands. Now, what ends up happening is you see a few things, or we see a lot of things when people ask us for advice. So one thing we always see is, oh, well, there's this hot hand. This player's slumping. Should I just drop him? And the answer is almost always no at this point in the season. It's too early to know. You have to give like 10 to 20 games for these guys. That's when things start to kind of normalize. And so what I advise to do is go through your roster for the next like 2 weeks and see who you bench the most. So especially on like slow days or whatever, let's say Saturdays, it's not slow days, but heavy days. On heavy days, take a look at who you start and who you don't start. Because, for example, for me, I had Jason Zucker, who I don't really start very much. He's benched, I think, 3 Saturdays in a row, 4 heavy days in a row. It's like, he's my guy. That is my guy that I know, okay, if there's a hot hand that actually excites me, that actually fits my holes, that's the one that I want to drop.
Fits your holes.
Fits my holes. And so that's what you want to have. You want to have in the back of your head at all times, who is my streamer drop? So that when it comes to someone to pick up, let's say all of a sudden this hot hand has a hat trick, you don't just go in and quickly drop whoever's just slumping. You have an idea already. Okay, I'm going to go in and this is the guy I'm dropping and this is why. And it should always be kind of built around roster maximization as opposed to slumping, in my opinion.
Yeah. Especially, actually in all leagues, roster maximization is kind of a major point. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but you definitely need to be keeping an eye on who you think is expendable on your roster. And that doesn't necessarily mean it'll always be the same player. You can have, you drafted players because you think there's upside there. So you don't necessarily need to be making moves immediately to react to day one stuff, which is already happening, right? Yesterday we saw Cody Glass kind of play pretty well. Quinn Hughes got an assist. There's been things happening already. Pacioretty actually looked pretty decent. So try not to overreact this early on. It's so easy to when you see these like hype guys do well right off the bat. if you have the flexibility, sure, but don't drop somebody that you think is actually has a pretty high floor and a decent ceiling for a guy that has an extremely low floor and maybe an okay ceiling because they scored a goal in their first game.
And then moving on to number 3, this is similar to what we just talked about a little bit, but it's be patient and wait out players. Don't rush to drop them, just like Brandon said. Like, if you know a guy was a steal, or if you had it, you did your research, you ran your numbers, wait out the player. It's okay. Sean Tierney, we actually tweeted him. He was posting preseason shot rates, so how good are people generating shots? And we asked him, okay, well, when does it, when do you start to actually see who the team is? And he said between 10 and 20 games is normally when you see everything normalize. So like I said before, give people time to just kind of figure themselves out and have the team actually get figured out as well. Okay, and then number 4 is work the wire. People will drop underperforming players. So Brandon is an expert at this, and he crushes everybody at working the wire every single year. So I'm going to let him explain this one.
Oh, I mean, this is. I feel like we're going to get again into this player a little bit later, but I feel like Tuukka Rask is the guy that always comes to mind every single season for this, where he'll struggle early in the first month or whatever, and people drop him, and then he winds up still being a pretty good goalie to have. But yeah, the idea is in your leagues, you just have to pay attention daily, at least once a day, take a look, see who's been dropped, and value them against what you think they're worth. Because people are especially certain GMs you'll see more than others in your league will be very kind of emotional about their players. And if somebody's slumping for even like 3 games, they'll get dropped, even if they're like a decent upside guy. I've seen Kyle Connor get dropped. You see, players that have pretty good upside and are in great positions. And so if a player gets dropped, the first thing you need to do is think about why that happened. Like, all right, did they drop this player because they are activating somebody that's better? Or do they drop him because his line changed, his time on ice changed? So just do your research. It's not that hard. You're looking at one player. All you got to do is look them up on Yahoo or Hockey Reference or anything, really, to get a basic idea of what's going on in the last couple of games. And if he still looks like he's playing in the position that you'd expect, and if you're still high on him, then, make a claim. But you have to be, if you're not in a free agent acquisition budget league, meaning you're in a standard waiver priority league, you don't want to be blowing a priority on a replacement level player that you might think is basically at the top of the waiver order. You probably just want to wait him out and get him as a free agent. But then you have to deal with all the West Coasters sitting around at midnight Pacific to pick up these guys as soon as they clear waivers. So that's all up to you on that point. But that's the basic idea. I'm more than picking up from waivers. I work for agency as much as I can, and it's mostly about roster maximization, which we'll talk about in a minute.
For number 5, you can step into the Fantasy Hockey Podcast psychology office, please, and have a seat over here on the couch. And essentially what we want to tell you is trust yourself and your draft. You did well. You did research. If you're listening to this right now, that means you listened to the podcast. That means you listened to player analysis. You went out of your way to learn things. If you did that, trust yourself. Trust the way you drafted and trust your players. You will be fine. The thing is, it's a long season. It's a very, very long season. There's a lot of weeks. Don't freak out first week and think, oh my God, I had such a bad draft. That's it. All my players are sucking. What am I going to do? Slow down. It's okay. And you know what? If a player is sucking and ends up sucking, it's fine. You probably did the best with what you had at the time from an information standpoint. It's not terrible. So that's the most important thing that we see a lot too, is we see people down on themselves, down on their draft. And it's like, seriously, trust yourself. If you're listening to this, like I said, you are one of the, whatever percent, I'd say, what is it, like 20% of people that go out of their way to listen to podcasts or something for fantasy hockey. I don't know what that percentage actually is, but you're probably one of the few, probably lower than that. But yeah, you're one of the few that are doing, extensive research, looking into things and trying to be the best drafter possible. And most likely you had a great draft. Okay, and this is now again Brandon's strategy. Let's step out of the office here and go on to number 6 and take you into the alley of Brandon. Focus on roster maximization, especially in Cats leagues.
Yeah, this is pretty straightforward. It's something we talk about all the time during the season on this podcast. And it's about making sure that you have so that player that you've noticed that is expendable, that's basically your streamer spot. And sometimes you'll have two, which may mean that your team is a little weak at the low end, but also gives you a bit of flexibility depending on how many ad drops you have per week. And what you want to do with this streamer position is weekly, you want to try to get as many starts as you can, because even if a player is a little bit better than the player that you have, if he's playing your off nights and you're going to be able to get 1 or 2 extra starts out of that player, it's worth it already just to go ahead and pick that player up and play him for the week. This is why our weekend preview episode exists. Beyond that, and suggesting some backup goaltenders possibly for spot starts, but the main reason is to look at guys who are going to avoid Saturday usually, as Saturday is typically the heaviest day, and play Friday, Sunday. And those guys are who you use to maximize, because you're probably going to be benching your bottom streamer spot on Saturday anyway, unless he's not playing Saturday. So if that streamer spot's benched Saturday, you basically most likely don't have another start from that player, and you could drop him and get 2 from somebody else who's probably pretty close. And that's what you want to be doing, especially on the weekend. But I'd say the 2 most important days to be looking for a streamer is on Monday, or if you have next day ad, then I guess Sunday. But to pick up on Monday and then play as many starts as you can, and then possibly swap them back out for a Friday, Sunday. That's typically what I try to do. That can get you up to like 5 starts, which is a lot, depending on how your week would have broken out with your previous player that you'd be dropping here. So that's kind of the idea. You just want to be able to flood as many starts as you can, because starts are points, regardless if the player's good or not. Yep. Unless they literally goose egg everything, which is unlikely.
Moving on to number 7, pay attention to lines, like a daily face-off, Twitter, beat writers, things like that, and check who's getting best deployment. And not necessarily even just pay attention, but check. So I think the main reason for that is you don't want to go after a hot hand just because you hear their name a lot. You have to check deployment. So for example, I think one of the best guys that we've gotten a lot of questions on, and is not worth an ad yet, even though I know they got a goal yesterday, is Ilya Mishiev. I know. You hear his name a lot. He's being hyped up and everything, right? So you see him getting added, and you're like, oh my God, I'm hearing Ilya Mishiev all over the radio. I'm hearing him all over the TV. Who is this guy? I need to get him. But then you jump in and you check his deployment, and he's third line, no power play. That's not worth a pickup. There are better players out there with better deployment. And what you care about is deployment. That's the important thing. So don't just react to goals and react to assists and react to, big names that are out there that you're hearing in media. And this also comes down to you have to take off the real life classes. You have to remember, like we say before, that fantasy hockey is its own entire separate universe, entire different world, where like sometimes the two worlds overlap. Just because a player is good in real life does not mean they are good in fantasy, or just because they are popular in real life does not mean they should be popular in fantasy. They're completely different worlds, and all of us live in a completely different fantasy world too, depending on our settings. So be sure to adjust to your world, not to the real world. Weird way to put that, but the best way I can think of. So that's really important. So pay attention to deployment. Super, super important as the season goes on, especially as people are trying to fill holes. Like oftentimes someone with better deployment will be better than like the hot hand that is at the end, for the purpose of at least maximizing roster starts. And then there's one other thing when it comes to maximizing roster starts, and that's number 8, at least for Cats leagues, and that's to play your opponent as a matchup and as needed. So Brandon is the one who reminded me of this, so he's going to take this one.
Yeah, so the basic idea here is this kind of a little bit loops into what I was saying before about targeting teams that have noticeable holes. Maybe not to the same extent, but basically when you're in a matchup in a Cats league, in a points league, this goes right out the window, but in a Cats league, you can see where the pain points are. You can glean from the projection, even if you're just using Yahoo projections, you can get a pretty good idea of where their strengths and weaknesses lie, unless they're a totally across the board balanced team, in which case that's what you want and you're going to have a tough matchup. But if they don't have that, you can see, okay, they're going to crush me in goals or something, but I'm going to crush them in assists, and it looks like hits are fairly close. So with that, you can consider that you don't need to chase goals because you're not going to catch up. You can possibly drop a low tier assist getter for a hitter, and you'll wind up with 2 categories to 1. And that's how you play your matchup. You basically, obviously, you don't want to overcorrect and wind up losing assists. But if you see that, especially as the league goes on, as the season progresses, this is harder to do week 1. But in week 10, for example, it's going to be easier to figure out what the team you're against is set up to be capable of, and try to make sure that you can get the tiebreaker categories, basically the ones that could go either way, while still solidifying the categories that you're more likely going to win. So if you can come out, you don't necessarily have to do this on every matchup. It's just the ones where you have a category that you're worried about losing, and you think you can get that while also not sacrificing another category at the same time.
Yeah,
that's the basic idea.
That's also really important to think about when you're playing someone you think is going to be battling you for first or an important playoff spot. When you're in those really important matchups, that's where that matters even more, because it doesn't matter. And, we say this a lot too in season. You'll hear this again later. It doesn't matter how much you win by. All that matters is that you win the week, right? Like that's all that matters. If you win, there's no difference really at the end of, there is for tie breaks, but aside from that, there's no difference between a 5-4 Cats win and 7-3 Cats win. It doesn't really matter. You won. And so you just want to win.
I would say that matters.
It matters for tiebreak, but it doesn't really matter in terms of let's say it's me against you. I don't care how I beat you. I just want to beat you.
Well, yeah, but if you win 7-3, that could jump you multiple spots up as opposed to 5-4.
Sure, but I will take a win however it comes when I know that it's really hard to beat you specifically, and you're going to be someone I'm going to be challenging for a top spot.
Yeah, you don't want to risk multiple categories if you don't have to. But at the same time, if you can win all the categories, that's much better.
Of course, it's always better, but in the sense of if I know against you, I'm going to be, really even, and it might end up 5-5 or something like that. I'd rather just beat you and go after this one category that might beat you than to risk it.
Yeah, to risk trying to win multiple categories when they're all toss-ups. You can just solidify one and make sure that, I hear what you're saying.
Okay, and then moving on to number 9. This one's kind of similar to number 7, but in terms of for points, so that one was Cats. For points, it's kind of similar, but just pay attention to point contribution. So again, it kind of gets back to that thing of when you're going to pick up a player, there's the hot hand and there's kind of the hot name. And it's easy to just say, oh, I'm in a points league. This guy's hot. I need to pick him up. I have to have him on my roster. When it really, you need to look at the point contribution. And even a hot hand, let's say they haven't played enough games. For example, Cody Glass, I think, is a fantastic example of this. If your league gives a lot of points to peripherals, he may not be worth it. Just because the point contribution that he's going to give you is much lower. And his floor is much lower as well. So you're kind of taking a risk. So if you say, for example, I'm going to drop a Dustin Brown for a Cody Glass, well, you better look at what that's going to do to your floor. Now, granted, you may not play Dustin Brown as much, but you still need to take a look at, okay, what happened? I'm losing out on shots and hits. What does that mean for me from a contribution standpoint? And that's really important. Okay, and then number 10, you want to queue up. If you use Fab, which is free agency acquisition budget, or continuous waivers, you want to queue up multiple options. That way you don't get screwed when it comes to needing players. So if you only queue up one and that person is taken, well, then now you don't pick up anybody. And so now you didn't get anybody at all. So you want to queue up multiple options and make sure that you get somebody for that day.
Yeah, I feel like this is something. I feel like a lot of leagues are switching to continuous waivers with free agent acquisition budgets. Our league did. In fact, I think all the leagues I'm in this season do that.
That's the new Yahoo standard too.
Oh, there you go. So actually, I think the only one I'm only in one league that does regular waivers. Oh no, actually, change of free agent acquisition. Yeah, all the leagues I am do this now. And I think so. A lot of GMs are coming in, and this is a new thing. So you get the idea. Like the concept is not that complicated, right? You're bidding on a player. On a lot of leagues, on Yahoo at least, you can bid 0. So that's essentially the same as adding from free agency like last season, except next day. The difference is you've never really had to worry about missing the player, typically. If you're doing next day add, then maybe via tiebreak. But for a lot of GMs, myself included, we typically did same day add. And so it was just first come, first serve, and that was that. So you didn't have to worry about it. But now that you do, especially with free agent acquisition budget, and especially in the beginning of the league, where people are looking at the same players. Everybody's starting to look at Victor Olofsson. They're starting to look at Cody Glass. They're starting to look at Alexander Nylander, these guys that are in good positions to start the season. Those are the guys that you're probably going to have to win some tie breaks. And if you don't, you need to have a backup plan, especially if you're doing something like, okay, let's say Timo Meier, right? He's on day-to-day now. So if you have an IR plus slot, you've probably moved him over, possibly Erik Karlsson as well, if you have him. And now you have to make a decision about who to pick up. Okay, maybe you're thinking, all right, Cody Glass looked pretty good last night. He's in a good position. I'll add him. The problem is 3 other GMs are also thinking the same thing. So you need to make sure that you might not get him. So adding 1 or maybe even 2 more guys. Like, let's say, okay, I'll add Olofsson, then Cody Glass, then Alexander Nylander, and you can order these. You can set your waiver priority on anything. So you'll be able to pick which one you want to have happen first. And if you fill your position, the rest of them will not go through. And then that's basically it. And I've seen this happen already in some of our new listener leagues and ours are weekly. So if you miss your guy, you're screwed for a week. Yep. So we've seen that happen, and it's a little bit of a learning experience, growing pains of how to deal with this. But the basic concept is make sure you have backup, and that's it, especially in weekly leagues.
Yeah, especially in weekly leagues. I mean, you can get seriously, seriously screwed, so pay attention to that. And then number 11, the final one here, is something we're calling, just like we have Ricky Rax as a thing, we have Multicap Monsters as a thing. There's a new thing. It's called the Rask Rule. Yep. Because we talk about it. It's been 3 years now that we talk about this, and it's don't overthink goalies early in the season. I mean, we're talking about players needing 10 to 20 games, right, to kind of normalize. Goalies need even more than that. It's like till halfway point in the season. And Rask does this every single year. Start slow. Midway through the season, people are dropping him all over the place. He gets picked up, and he ends up being crucial in the playoffs. And especially like also from a starts perspective, just start your goalies early. I don't.
Yeah, don't overthink it for sure.
Don't overthink it. I mean, if you want to play the matchup, go for it, I guess. But I don't advocate for it, especially early in a week like this where it's an extended week. Just play your goalies, see what you got. You never know. I mean, especially right now when you literally don't know who teams are. Like, you can't, like Mike Smith last night had an incredible game. Would you have predicted that? Hell no. So just play your goalies, see what you got, go with it. The chance of you benching a good game versus a bad game, I'd say right now are virtually equal in some matches. There's just no point in trying to predict it. So I'd just play your guys. Don't overthink it early. I mean, that kind of goes for a lot of things, really, but especially with goaltenders, just don't overthink them. You're gonna be fine.
Yep.
Okay, and there you go. So if we missed anything, or if you want tips on something specific or have questions, you can find us on Twitter at FantasyHockeyPD, or you can find us in our Discord. If you go to our site, fantasyhockeypodcast.com, there's also draft tools there to maximize your schedule. And on top of that, of course, you can find the link to the Discord. And other than that, we will be back. So all our kind of in-season content that we talked about will start Monday. We're not going to do a weekend preview just because the season literally just started. There's not really too much to talk about. We could talk about pickups, but we're going to give it a few days to settle, see who's actually playing well, and we'll come to you with really solid pickups on Monday.
Yep, and that's it. Thanks for listening.